Good morning. My name is Darren Peschel, and I'm the Senior Vice President in charge of the Houston branch. And on behalf of our nation's central bank, I want to extend a warm welcome to each of you. We've been doing these programs here at the Houston Fed for about a decade. We have to take a hiatus during COVID, and we're so excited to be back in person. So thank you for joining us back here again today. I would especially like to recognize the special partnership between Texas McCombs and the Dallas Fed. We serve on councils together, we put on events like this together, and we share economic research. So in January, when our new Dallas Fed president, Lori Logan, was deciding where to give her inaugural remarks as a voting member of the FOMC as Dallas Fed president, UT McCombs was a logical venue. And I want to thank Dean Mills for that distinctive honor and for her leadership to build bridges across academia, industry, and communities. Dean Mills will introduce our panelists in a few moments, but for those of you that have not heard them, you're in for a treat today. I'd also like to introduce a very special guest with us today, and that is Mike Schetzel. Mike joined the Dallas Fed just about 3 months ago as our new Chief of Staff of the Dallas Fed. Prior to joining the Dallas Fed, he was the Senior Policy Advisor in the International Policy and Strategy function at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Markets Group, where he led bank international engagement and strategy. He also spent 2 years at the Bank of England in foreign reserves and was a key liaison with the U.S. Treasury during the early days of the global financial crisis. Welcome, Mike. Thank you for being here. At the conclusion of today's breakfast, I also invite you to learn more about the Federal Reserve, and we have a visitor center just inside the entrance, and you can learn more about our role in monetary policy, banking supervision, payments, and community leadership. And with that, let me please ask for a round of applause to welcome Dean Mills to the Houston Fed.
Thank you, Darren, for welcoming us here today, and for all of you for being here at our 11th annual event. This is an annual tradition and one that I was so pleased when I became dean that I got to carry forward. Darren, thank you for serving on our McCombs Advisory Council and becoming my friend over these years. I'm Lillian Mills. I'm the dean of the McCombs School of Business, and we are doing energy here in Houston. Later this spring, the Federal Reserve Board will talk with us about real estate in Dallas, and you're welcome at that as well. We have question cards on the table. There were any number of pre-submitted questions, and I have enthusiastic panelists who will find it difficult to keep answers short. So we may or may not get to a lot of spontaneous audience questions, but if you have them, go ahead and write them down and Christine can pick them up. And so I'd now like to introduce our panelists. Jesse Thompson is the Senior Business Analyst at the Houston branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. He performs the research and analysis on issues about Houston and the Gulf Coast economy, and in particular hydrocarbon industries, and collects information for the Dallas Fed's Beige Book of Current Economic Conditions, the author of Monthly Energy Indicators, the Houston Economic Indicators, and contributes to the quarterly publication Southwest Economy. David Baldwin joined SCF in 1991 and is their partner in charge of the firm's energy transition initiatives, where he is responsible for SCF's energy transition strategy, including new platform investments, helping existing companies develop new energy markets. Previously, he was co-president of the firm and led their efforts in financing to build North American-focused companies. David has supported development and creation of public companies, National Oil Well Varco, Oil States International, Complete Production Services, and Forum Energy Technologies, and he works closely with 9 Energy Services and Select Energy Services. He is a Longhorn with a degree in petroleum engineering and his MBA from the McCombs School of Business. My colleague Laura Starks is the George Kosmetsky Centennial University Distinguished Chair at the McCombs School of Business, where she teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in finance on environmental, social, and governance investing. She is the academic thought leader in ESG issues, including climate finance and board diversity, as well as molecular genetics and financial decisions. Laura has won numerous awards for both her teaching and her research, and she received her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. So I'm so pleased to learn from these three colleagues here on stage. It's been a year. We just, celebrate is the wrong word. We just marked that just over a year ago, the war in Ukraine began, and that was a new turbulence in energy markets on top of the upheaval from COVID. And both of those, plus some ice storms in Texas, are on top of what had been a decade of increasing push around climate issues and ESG. And so we're in a marketplace that desperately needs energy security, and we need base load, and we need peak loads, and we're still trying to navigate what the markets think of that, where the investment dollars are going. And so those all have significant impacts on the economy in the whole world, the state of Texas, and specifically in Houston. So we're going to talk about that today. But I'm going to kick it off with Jesse at the Federal Reserve to look back at the last year or so between the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the Texas winter weather. Were there other factors affecting our energy markets? And then what can you and will you tell us about outlooks for the rest of 2023 in GDP, inflation, and the fossil fuel industry?
In 3 minutes or less.
Yes.
Before I say anything, of course, I work at the Fed, so I have to tell you my opinions are mine and mine alone, and not necessarily represented the views of the Federal Board of Governors, Bank President, officers, or anyone else associated with those in the forum. And what happened with energy in 2021 and 2022? Other than, of course, we had the war and we had geopolitical issues with the imposition of sanctions. What was going to happen with those sanctions? There was a lot of uncertainty about that. Uncertainty among many. There were some who were quite certain about what would happen with crude, but we're still figuring out what's going to happen with our fuel market. I'd say the underlying thing underneath all of that we were dealing with here, at least with our energy outlook and our energy world here, was number one, on the upstream oil and gas side, 2021 was a year dominated by capital discipline. And what does that mean? That means that after decades of losing money, we had to prove that we could earn money. And so that was 2021, and and you get to 2022, and I'm speaking generally here about the calendar. And what dominated. You get to 2022, and really it's more about supply chain and labor force, constraining the ability to do anything. And this is not just about, you can't attract people to the oil field. It's, you can't even get equipment delivered to deploy more people to the oil field at a reasonable pace. The oil and gas industry was late to the supply chain challenges that the rest of the business world was dealing with during 2021. And when you look forward to 2023 in the oil and gas sector, I think you're going to see a plateauing of some of those issues. So labor force probably isn't going to get much easier, but it does seem to be the case that it's not getting worse in terms of their ability to attract labor or their wage pressures. They are still there. It's still challenging, but it doesn't seem to be getting worse anymore. So that's an improvement. On the supply chain side, it's just going to take a while for orders that were made 6 months ago to get filled later this year. It's going to take a while for that to work itself out, but it is going to be one of improvement. But slow, steady growth, I think, is what we're in terms of the domestic energy market. Oil and gas, oil production up maybe, I think if you believe the consensus of forecasts out there, somewhere around 0.3 million barrels per day. That's half what we grew in 2022. And I honestly think it'll probably be a little bit more than that, but slower growth, but growth nonetheless in oil and gas.
And do you have anything you want to say about inflation?
Sure. I'll say this about inflation. The most common phrase uttered about inflation from 2021 to 22 through 2022 was, "Well, inflation has probably peaked," and of course that was wrong many times over. And in fact, credit to Dallas Fed business surveys, the business community saw the inflation and was aware of the inflation long before the traditional measures of inflation were the inflation problem that we were living with. As far as outlook goes, I'll say this. The blue chip consensus forecast, I like averages of lots of forecasts because they tend to do better than any individual forecaster, but every individual forecaster will never let you forget the one time they were the one who got it right.
Sure.
But if you look at that blue chip consensus, what it tells you about inflation is that on balance, the community of people out there trying to figure this stuff out don't think that we're going to get to the Fed's target rate of inflation until sometime in the middle of 2024. Now, that doesn't mean that they're right, but that's where the consensus of forecasters that are published out there is saying.
Okay, well, I'm going to turn to David to talk about the energy mix a little bit. And you might view it as a trade-off, you might view it as additive, but we've got different energy sources, some of which provide reliable base loads, others are better able to respond to peak loads. Do you think investors, and especially voters, politicians, citizens, understand the mix of energy types available in a given country or region that need to be deployed for reliability, for security, for national security?
Well, it's a great question, Dean Mills. And even though we're talking about that in the context of 2023, you have to start by understanding that our energy system was built over the last 170 years. And we've basically spent between $1 and $2 trillion a year for 170 years. So you're talking about a global system that costs $200 to $250 trillion. Today, we spend between $1 and $2 trillion a year on energy and clean energy, both. So this is going to be a slow move at the current pace of spending. In Texas, we're extremely blessed. We're the largest oil producer, we're the largest gas producer, we're the second largest wind provider, we'll be number one. We're second largest in solar. So, and we will lead the hydrogen economy in the US. So sitting in Texas or in the United States, we have an abundance of energy sources. So layering new things on top of our existing system is going to work really well for Texas and for the United States, for sure. We will see more weather volatility and we will see more energy volatility. So if you don't have a generator, get one. Be a good idea. But I think sitting here versus sitting in Germany or Spain is a very different feel right now because we have cheap, reliable, affordable, secure energy for a long time. Now we just need to go decarbonize it.
Well, Laura, I'm going to have you help with education and reset around an acronym that has a lot of political lightning rod around it right now, ESG. And I think we could all use a fresh baseline definition, some examples. Where's it misunderstood? And is there any hope of increasing a better understanding?
Well, that would be my hope. So I have been teaching ESG investing since 2011. The term was not political until last year. And I teach it, I'm a finance professor. I teach it from a financial economics perspective. But people don't understand what it means, partly because even people that are practicing ESG investing don't agree on what it means. And so I view two types of ESG investing. One is the ESG investors who are looking at the risk. So for years, we've been looking at the risk, governance risk of companies. For years, we've been looking at environmental risks for companies, the economic risk, the social risk. And so ESG just became an easy way of capturing, hey, we're looking at the risk. So that's a financial, I call these the value investors. They're also the ESG values investors. And these are making their decisions on where to invest their money because they want it to reflect their preferences. And for years, we've had socially responsible investing funds We have Catholic funds. We have Islamic funds. We have funds where people are interested in animal rights. These people want to invest according to their preferences. In terms of the fund managers, there are some that are doing their fiduciary duty by investing according to people's preferences. There's some, they're offering special types of funds. There are others that are, again, using E, S, and G aspects of companies in order to have a better lens on the risk that those companies are facing. And the one other thing I want to point out is, just because you're an ESG fund doesn't mean that you believe in divesting fossil fuels. Because if you really want to be low carbon, you're going to have to divest a lot of companies. You're going to have to get rid of a lot of sectors. So there are a number of ESG funds that are invested in fossil fuel companies.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I want to go back to Jesse about decarbonization focus on some of the investors around cost of energy, and if capital shifts some from traditional petrocarbons into transition, how does that affect energy prices in the economy? And maybe I would phrase it as, to what extent is energy transition a luxury good rather than a necessity like rice and potatoes?
Well, as far as necessity goes, I guess that can vary depending on your preferences and your concern and how you rank your concerns. But I think the simple answer, the simple Econ 101 answer is, all else being held equal. Never is, but all else being held equal. What we're doing here is we're internalizing a cost. We're bringing a cost into the system. We're trying to pay down some of the interest, maybe even eventually some of the principal on this climate debt that we've been accumulating the last 150 years. And that, by definition, all else being held equal, puts upward pressure on costs. When you look at the expenditure shares of, say, what we spend on fossil fuels as a household, say, what are we spending on gasoline and diesel, and what are we spending on electricity and natural gas? We spend much more on fossil fuels. It's about double. And so, to the extent that we push up prices on electricity, if we go through electrification, what does the rush for commodities? As there's a lot of front-end investment in order to get the energy transition underway, big capital investments. What does that do for inflationary pressures for supply chains? If we switched, what is the net effect of that? I think it's still pretty messy, but on balance, I would expect it to put upward pressure on prices generally.
Yeah. And David, you work in private equity. Where are the investment dollars flowing? And has that changed some in 2022 compared to prior years as energy security has become a greater global concern?
Well, if you look at clean energy versus fossil fuel industries, they both spend about $1 trillion a year right now globally. The traditional fossil fuel business is probably more of a flat, sort of maintain its current level of production business, and that will take about $1 trillion a year. The good news is that the free cash flow that's being generated at reasonable prices will fuel a flat market. All the cash deficits that were being run was when the U.S. was really growing their production. But so I think financing the traditional hydrocarbon business is not an issue now. It's a healthy industry. The bank lending is relatively stable, and the companies have plenty of capital at reasonable commodity prices. Surprisingly, the deficit is on the new energy because the returns have not been great. There's more risk. It's a longer tail or a longer discount rate involved. And we really have to go from $1 trillion a year to $4 or $5 trillion a year if we want to come close to hitting 2050 goals, which looks pretty unlikely now. So in a funny way, people think that capital starved traditional energy, and that's really not the case. Capital and returns are starved in the new energy area. So,
yeah. Laura, what are you hearing about investors, about the energy companies? And I know you did some consulting to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. How is an oil-rich country like Norway approaching energy transition?
Well, it was really interesting. I was on they called it a strategic council, and then the next year I was on an expert panel where we were looking at different aspects of how they should invest the sovereign wealth fund. But the expert panel was whether the sovereign wealth fund should be used as a tool in fighting climate change. And we wrote a 75-page report, part of which we said, look, we're going to be using oil and gas for many, many years into the future. We can't not do this. And so, so our recommendation was, no, you don't divest. And partly, if you think about it, all of the money coming into the sovereign wealth fund comes from the North Sea oil.
Right.
And so then a few years later, they decided to divest of oil and gas exploration firms. And the divestment community said, oh, look, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is now divesting. Well, they were only divesting because of diversification, because their money was coming in from that. And so they only divested the certain types of exploration firms that would be close to where they were getting their money from.
Well, let's turn a little bit to the future. And David, you've been working with Greentown Labs and TexE, and that is a partnership also with the University of Texas at Austin. So talk about that partnership and what we're doing at McCombs and elsewhere at UT.
So the partnership between Greentown Labs and TexE is really intended to enrich the Houston and Texas economies by building a more robust startup community and innovation community around new energy. And it's led by MIT and Greentown Labs, and University of Texas, Texas A&M, Rice, U of H, and Prairie View A&M are our co-partners. The idea is we want to equip the leaders, the entrepreneurs, the students, the employees of the future with the skills necessary to help lead and drive the energy transition. So a broader base of climate knowledge, a broader base of economics, a broader base of what it takes to disrupt and build new companies. All of that is what the partnership is focused on, and I'm really excited to say we have 90 companies in Greentown Labs today, and we're a year and a half into that adventure. In Boston, they have 400 companies that have gone through clean tech. So Boston is the clean tech capital of the world today. But they're partnering with Houston and Texas so that we can work together and together share what each brings to the opportunity. So it's super fun. And Dean Mills, all the universities are playing really well together. And I know Dr. Starks has led a big initiative collaborating amongst universities, but it's exciting to see what's happening with the young students today. They want to lead this transition. We just need to give them the skills and the resources to do it.
And President Hartzell and I say University of Texas at Austin is the University of and, not or. So I invite you, if there's still room, our energy golf outing is this Friday, which the KBH Energy Center that's joint with the law school, really it has its roots in traditional oil and gas petrocarbons. And also at McCombs, we have a sustainability institute joint with the Moody College, because I think any of the discussions in this area need to be driven by business leaders who can really think about costs and benefits and not make decisions just based on feel good, just on, to use Laura's word, values. We need hard data. We need to be careful. And with higher interest rates, really long payoffs don't look as promising as when interest rates are practically zero. So we're trying to be the serious people at the table about this. Let's keep talking about the future, Laura, and what are you doing when you're teaching students that help students bring this rational mind to issues of trade-offs and costs and benefits?
So I think there are a couple of things. David was talking about my collaborating with other universities. The University of Texas is collaborating with Harvard, Oxford, Columbia, Yale, Stanford, and Imperial College London. There are 7 of us faculty. You notice we're the only public school in this group.
Yep.
that we're offering a PhD class in climate finance, which is, the first. It's a Zoom class because we have students from all around, but it's a amazing class, and to see how many students, it has over 150 students that are joining this Zoom class, and with that class, as well as with my undergraduates, the Masters in Finance students, the MBA students, they're really, the McCombs students are brilliant. And I'm not just biased, they absolutely are. But they are also very critical thinkers. And I have a number of students that are taking my class that are planning to come back to Houston to go into the traditional oil and gas industry. But they want to understand how we need to think about climate transition and how they can make a difference. So one thing I really noticed about the students today is they want to make a difference, and they want to use their skills to make a difference.
Good. Well, we had a number of pre-submitted questions, and they were all excellent, so we've got time to do a bunch of those. And one of them came back to this affordability question, Jesse, and maybe you'll want to tackle that. Part of the transition is going to require different and new raw materials, minerals, battery production. How is that going to hold back any energy transition because of either the available supply or where the supply is?
So there's a number of critical minerals that you might think about. So, the big one that we all hear about, the 2 that we hear about the most about are, of course, lithium and cobalt. Lithium, it's actually quite plentiful, just not very plentiful in any concentration that you can do much with it. And so the bottleneck there really is the refining side. There's investments that are ongoing. You can get the raw materials, but getting the refineries built in order to turn that into a grade of product you can actually use for the electrification, for the energy transition, is a challenge. And it takes many, many years or no permitting issues in order to get those things done. And so there are definitely same thing with cobalt. Now you say we've got some other enhancements of supply that have come on as firms go looking, as now that the returns are there. But Democratic Republic of Congo is still where that all kind of comes from, and there are definitely some social concerns there. And you worry about equity, right? Like, okay, if we are building up our batteries here, or building up our copper or other components on the further down the manufacturing chain in the United States, well, then are we pushing the pollution or the burden, the environmental burden of those onto countries where they don't have guardrails in place to protect local water supply, local communities that we have in the West, that we have, or I should say, in more developed countries is what I should say. So there are definitely equity concerns there that are going to be problematic, and to the extent that you address them, they add cost.
Right.
And so that's a problem.
Well, we did get an advanced question one more time about inflation and about Fed rates, and it was, suppose we can finally get inflation back down to 2%. The question is posed was, will the Fed then start lowering interest rates to stimulate the economy? But maybe you'd like to just talk about those pathways and how you think about it.
So longer run, obviously, like the Fed's, all of our decisions are going to be data-based, right? I present for your entertainment a tap dance. So all of them are going to be data-based. The framework that the Fed is using has been published. We are looking for inflation, long-run inflation averaging. We want inflation to be at or near target for a period of time before we sort of change course. And the presidents, the bank presidents, and the board of governors have been very, very, I think, forthright and transparent on this fact. The question you have to ask yourself is, will they start lowering rates at some point? Well, you have to ask yourself, well, longer run, what do you think the neutral rate is? Mm-hmm. And for those of you who are looking for something to Google to put yourself that you can read and put yourself to sleep at night tonight, the neutral rate is basically the federal funds. It's this idea, like there's a rate of a federal funds rate at which that we are neither stimulating the economy nor are we really putting the brakes on it. And there you can debate. There's a lot of different estimates out there, but something in the low to mid threes is widely regarded as the neutral rate. It's a moving target. It evolves as we get better understanding of the economy, and so as we move into a period where inflation has met the targets for the Fed to be in our zone on a moving average basis, as dictated by the framework, then you could expect the Fed is going to, at some point, try to move back towards that neutral rate rather than be restrictive.
Well, I'd like to talk about hydrogen and where is the future of using hydrogen? And as I've tried to educate myself in this sphere, I know part of it is an infrastructure issue. You can't just quit pumping oil and gas through a pipeline and pump hydrogen through it. It's different pressures, different sealants, everything else. So I don't know who wants to grab this one. Is it you, David?
I'm happy to make a few comments. First of all, hydrogen is much more expensive in the United States than natural gas. That's the first thing, and they're sort of competitors with each other. In Europe and the UK, they're closer to parity. When you're talking about gas prices over there being $20 to $30 an MMBTU, all of a sudden blue hydrogen and gray hydrogen start to look pretty attractive. The other thing is they have a lot of wind in the North Sea. So all across the borders of the North Sea, from the Netherlands to Denmark to the UK, you see big hydrogen projects taking off. They're taking advantage of wind that's available and abundant. They're taking advantage of natural gas infrastructure that's not full, because the sort of first wave of hydrogen is you put hydrogen in natural gas streams, and that cuts the carbon content of that burner tip, if you will. And it gets the economy moving. It gets the markets developed. So I think you're going to see hydrogen really take off in Europe and UK first. Now, the IRA bill has been incredibly stimulus for hydrogen here, so we don't fall behind. So they're trying to make us sort of get in the game a little bit with that. But right now, I think you'll see the real markets for hydrogen develop faster in the UK and Europe because of their otherwise expensive energy.
And now I'm going to call an audible. What about nuclear power? And, Germany shut down reactors, and I think many of my business colleagues in Germany regret that. France has managed. In the U.S., we still have a lot of political nervousness around nuclear power, but we have uranium in abundance in the U.S. So what's it going to take to change the regulatory environment to provide more nuclear power in the U.S.?
I'll take a first shot. Even Texans are wary of moving nuclear waste through their property. We could have expanded nuclear here in Texas. We have a ready-made site to dispose of our nuclear waste. And the nuclear waste stream from power generation is very small. I mean, it's the vast majority of the nuclear waste that we have comes from the weapons program. It doesn't come from the power sector. So we've got to be willing to move it. If we could dispose of it, and I think then that would be a big dispose of the waste and moving it to a secure site, dump it in the ground for ever. We have sites that we can do that. The problem that'd be a big cost hurdle to overcome in terms of recurring costs of having to maintain storage on site, because you can't really dispose of it. But that doesn't necessarily get rid of what I would call, I think it's fair to say, the paranoia around nuclear fission. as something that could play a very important nearly carbon-free base role. And I say nearly carbon-free because you have to build the thing first. Right. But that's definitely a challenge to overcome, is that fear. I'm pessimistic. We 11th district, southern New Mexico is in the 11th district of the Dallas Fed territory. There are a number of producers there who've been every time we go out there, there's 20 nuclear power plants in some stage of permitting or request or whatever things. They've been there for as long as I've been paid attention to it for at least 20 years. So on nuclear fission, I think that's it.
Yeah.
Fusion, well, we'll save that for later if there's time.
Laura, can you see in the investment markets how investor attitudes are about nuclear?
And they've certainly changed over the last year.
Right.
In fact, particularly in Europe. And Europe has very, very strong environmental cultural norms. So Europe is investment community is very different from the U.S. investment community. And they have decided that, well, maybe nuclear is okay, when previously a number of them were saying, no, we don't want anything to do with it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Which integrated oil and gas company do you think is furthest along in developing distributed energy resources for the market? And what's the net result of the ESG accounting and disclosure requirements out among public companies?
I'll jump into that. And we recently did an analysis that was really fun. Is we took 8 of the largest global international oil companies, so not national oil companies, but international oil companies, and we looked at them and graded them across what percentage of their income comes from clean energy versus traditional energy. And Ørsted, which is the old Danish oil and gas company, essentially sold all their oil and gas and got solely into wind. And over the last 5 years, their shareholder returns have been the highest, surprisingly. So their total shareholder return has been number 1 in that period. They were early. They have great wind resources. They, had low cost when they were developing their wind resources, and they've done very well. And as you go across the spectrum, you're generally seeing BP and Shell and the Norwegian National Oil Company all sort of following a slow transition, where Chevron and Exxon are more focused still on traditional. So it's funny, you jump from Ørsted to Exxon, and Chevron is the second and third highest returns, and the last place was BP. And so BP, and I think you just saw an announcement saying that they're sort of pivoting a little bit back towards oil and gas. So it's a very complicated time. All the companies are using their cash flow from their traditional businesses to sort of explore these new areas based on their regions, but it's complicated.
So there was a great question about history. This writer says that energy transition rarely means replacement. In the near term, which near term can last fairly long, it's energy addition. You get a new source and it adds on top of what we're doing. So the projections this writer is looking at shows that regardless of the transition renewables, that we're projecting a flat or an increased absolute use of natural gas, oil, and coal for the world, even if it's a small decrease in the percentage of total energy. Do you agree, and maybe I'll ask all three of you, and if so, how can all of us better educate the citizenry, the voting public, the news media about that reality?
I guess we'll go down the road. So I think first off, you got to be careful about what time frame you're talking about. I think a lot of the conversation we're implicitly talking about 2050, and I think between now and 2050 on a number of different policy paths, take which study you like. That's a perfectly astute, that's very absolutely fair. One of the points that I like to bring out when this question or a question like this comes up is that if the world goes down a much more aggressive electrification path than we are currently on, for example, in order to get to net zero by 2050, then we would still have more internal combustion engines on the road globally in 2030, 2035 than there are today. And those would also be the longest lasting, most durable fleet of cars that had ever been deployed globally. So, I think certainly over that time frame, the notion that you're going to see a huge decline in fossil fuels consumption is maybe, again, as a share, I think is unlikely. Maybe you get into the 2040s, you'll start to see a bit more of an erosion. But that would be my 2 cents on that.
Yeah. Laura?
So I think there's so much uncertainty, we don't know what's going to happen. We
Right.
don't, somebody may innovate with carbon capture and storage, and that changes
Everything.
And so I think it's difficult to say, what path, and Jesse's right, there's so many different paths that we can be going down. It'll be interesting to see. But there's also different policy makers around the world, in terms of the Chinese people want to see some decarbonization because they have so many coal plants that are causing pollution. So that's, the Chinese government has a national cap and trade market. And so seeing how some of these countries change. India doesn't seem to be moving, but again, they're going to have a population that wants to see not as much pollution. So what path this is going to take?
Right.
Don't know.
I'll just make a couple of comments. Most forecasts suggest that by 2050, energy demand will be up 40 to 50% higher than it is today.
Okay.
So that's going to require a lot more stuff, if you will. The second thing, all these pathways that show us getting to net zero by 2050, almost all of them are pathways designed to force our economy to net zero, but don't consider the economic implications or the current policies in place to do that. So when you hear that we're, got a plan to get to net zero by 2050, that plan also involves being down by 40% by 2030. We're going to be up by 15% in 2030, just to give you some data. So the idea that we're on this path to net zero is not correct. We are going to have to grow energy a lot. We're still burning as much wood and dung as we did 100 years ago. So we've got a big challenge ahead of us. Now, 2050 is going to be hotter than it is today, too, and that's a problem. It's going to be a big problem, for your grandchildren also. So we have a dual challenge. We have to supply the world with affordable, reliable energy, and we have to reduce carbon. And we're not on track to do that right now.
So the ESG disclosures seem to have caused some shift in what companies are public and which are private. Do you agree? Do you see more shift towards private ownership of messier companies?
There is that claim. The problem is that a lot of private equity is owned by institutional investors who want to know, especially asset owners, who want to know what their private equity firms are doing.
Right.
So I think they're getting a lot of the pressure as well.
We have this microcosm that we generally work for universities. University of Texas is our largest investor, and you go down to the biggest endowments, and Harvard, Stanford, they're all our big investors. The family offices are the ones, the wealthy individuals are the ones that want to invest in energy private equity now. The universities are having more and more struggles to overcome campus pressure or what have you to keep investing in traditional oil and gas. So there's definitely a confusion going on right now, for sure.
Well, it feels like summer is on the horizon in Texas already. It's been warmer than I would like this past week. But how's our energy system and our grid doing if we have another winter storm Uri in the future?
Well, I see you looking at me. So the ERCOT has definitely made some progress, in terms of they're changing their pricing structure when you get close to that minimum spare capacity that's spun up. So there's more capacity, power capacity that can come online, that's incentivized to come online in order to make sure that we don't have brownouts. You have a lot of critical infrastructure that since Winter Storm Uri, they took an intern and had them fill out the 2-page form to let the utility know that they were in point of fact critical infrastructure. And so if you have a power outage situation, the utilities guy who's just flipping switches is not going to shut down the natural gas pumping stations. So that's good, especially if you heat your home with natural gas. But there's still an underlying challenge where we've got a system that has prioritized low average pricing.
Yes.
And as such, you're not going, and so you've wound up with underinvestment in capacity, or an underdeployment of spare capacity. And with the population growth that we're seeing, with the weather variability that is likely on the horizon, it's not clear that those. It remains to be seen if that's enough.
I'm going to buy a generator.
One thing that's, again, we're so blessed in Texas because we do have low cost energy, and for the most part, the reliability is extremely high. And we have a nonprofit project working on energy and climate. One of our members is from South Africa, and she has an app on her phone, and it shows her when her blackout is going to occur every day. And any of you have visited South Africa, it's a pretty modern, developed economy. But she doesn't know whether her children will be able to read at night and do their homework. She doesn't know whether the air conditioning will come on, and it's rolling blackouts, and they're getting more and more prevalent every year. And I just think, we can complain about ERCOT, but we live in a really, really good place for energy. So.
Yeah. So compare then, we have U.S., we have South Africa. What's happening in developing countries? Does anybody have comments there about, because they have less infrastructure, they have less capital to deploy. Are we going to get off of wood and dung and soft coal? And
I'll share some data, and then Jesse and Dr. Starks jump in. But so over the last 30 years, we've grown energy demand globally by about 60%. And almost 70% of that incremental demand has come from China. Okay, they have $1.4 billion, and their GDP per person is about $14,000 a year. So India is the same population and is about a fifth of the GDP per person, and is just starting that same growth ramp. And they are very sensitive to climate change. They're investing in renewables, but coal is available to them, and is cheap and is available. And they have to grow their economy.
Yes.
So if you think about what China has done, growing over the last 30 years, you've got India in the takeoff ramp right behind them. And then if you slot behind that Africa, another 1.4 billion people, they're sort of in that same dynamic that India is today. So sitting in Europe or the US, where a third of energy demand today will be 20% of energy demand in 30 years. And the world is just going to be dictated, and climate progress, energy demand is all going to come from these developing countries. So if we can't help them make a ratable and equitable energy transition, we're going to be disappointed in the results.
Well, and so there's been this big effort to get more efficient cook stoves into homes in the developing world, and because it's causing a lot of health problems. But what they found is that they don't use them as much, and they go back. They don't give up their old, peat or coal stove. And so the transition is not happening as fast at the local level as people had hoped for.
Okay. There were a couple of questions around supply chain and the pollution of the steel necessary to build wind turbines. The supply chain question was about solar panels from China. If we create more manufacturing capacity in the U.S., then that itself is a big need for concrete and steel to build the manufacturing plants. What are your analyses showing about the net benefit of the cost of carbon to build wind turbines and solar panels and the pollution around solar panels? Like, how do you assess all of that over a life cycle?
Well, I'll just point you to a resource that I find is a nice, objective, or relatively good resource. They've got this great harmonization project out there at the National Renewable Energy Lab. They have a life cycle analysis harmonization project.
Okay.
And where they've taken, they update it every year as new studies come out, and they're trying to look at, well, net, all in supply chain, birth to death, as best as we can approximate it, what is the net carbon footprint per unit of capacity?
Okay.
And this is generally framed in electric and kilowatt hours, but they look at that. And they find that on renewables, even with all of that upfront cost and all of that, you think about, why is polysilicon or monosilicon crystal so cheap? Well, it's because all of the processing in China is powered by dirt cheap coal. You do your best to kind of do the math on that, and you still come out ahead over the life cycle of the capacity.
Okay.
That doesn't answer the other problems of trying to integrate a highly complex, mix of renewables and other things, but you still come out ahead on those renewables in terms of carbon footprint.
Okay. Let's see. This is a question about 4 to 5 trillion is needed for non-traditional energy, but from an investment return standpoint, what's the path to profitability for the PE VC investor?
That's the challenging area right now. Is if you're a climate enthusiast, the good news is that a lot of people are willing to invest without making a great economic return. And an example of that is Amazon, really trying to decarbonize their delivery fleets. They see that as an imperative that their stakeholders want. So they're willing to electrify their vehicles, they're willing to experiment with hydrogen in their airplanes, things like that. That's not the cheapest way of doing it today. So they will invest at a return that a private equity investor won't invest at. So there is a lot of this imperative investing that's starting to prime the pump, if you will, and hopefully that drives costs down, starts to bring returns, more favorable for private equity developers. So we've seen what's happened with wind and solar. The investment in the technology has driven the cost down dramatically by 80 or 90%. But today, who's going to prime the pump of hydrogen or batteries or long duration storage? So, but there are investors out there doing it for this imperative reason. So
This is where the values investors come in.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're impact investors, and they want to make a difference, and they're the ones who are willing to put in this money.
not value investors.
Not values.
investors.
Values investors.
Right.
Yeah. And that at that same token, government. Like this is where a government role
Right.
traditionally is, and like low rate of return, but there's a big policy need, perceived social cost that we're dealing with that we want to offset. That is a public finance 101. This is a place for government to come in and put a price on carbon, or either directly or indirectly to get that ball moving.
The IRA bill.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
Well, we are running out of time at this point, so I think we might be able to take one last audience question, and then I will thank my speakers.
No, please.
Right up front.
Yeah. Realistically, how much can wind and solar provide?
As a percent of the energy mix, I'll repeat the question. Realistically, how much of the world's energy need can wind and solar provide?
I'll give a good metric on that. So in the last 10 years, we've spent $5 trillion globally on wind and solar, and it's gone from 0.5% of total energy supplies to 3%. So it's grown, and during that time period, it's provided about 10% of the incremental energy globally. So, and that's by far the fastest rate of growth, and natural gas would be second behind that. But the bottom line is the law of big numbers. And we've put all of our wind and solar in the places that are the absolute best places. We already have the transmission lines. We've got, good wind and solar. We don't have to move it very far. Those places, just like sweet spots in shale, are they're not everywhere. So the next wave of wind and solar is going to mean new infrastructure being built and, maybe cloudier environments for that solar. But it's a big number.
But also you got more efficient, sorry, go ahead.
I was asking what,
It's 3% globally today.
Do you think,
future in the best case scenario, what are you?
Oh, I think 2050 will be much higher than that. It'll be 10% or something like that. Yeah.
I think it depends on what assumptions you make. Again, to technology, to comment earlier, it depends on what assumptions you make about different types of storage and different types, and really that's what it really comes down to is batteries or some other type of carbon offset neutral peaking or balancing technology. Without batteries, and this is not my research, this is a work that has come through that I'm aware of through some of our private equity contacts in this industry, is that you could really probably get to around a third of our grid being renewables with basically very minute increases in battery power. But beyond that, the variability problem becomes very difficult to surmount with based on what we know so far. And so at that point, you really got to have more backup power, be it battery or something else, in order that you can spin up if wind and solar are not available in late afternoon on a hot day.
Right.
You got to have something to back that up. And so there is a threshold where you max out. You get more storage, you get advanced batteries, grid level storage batteries, you get advanced hydrogen technology for grid level storage. You start to change that equation. But
Electricity is 25% of all the energy we consume globally today, though. So when he says a third could be renewables, it's a third of 25%. So you have to put that in context of all energy. Right now, a quarter of all of our energy consumed globally comes from electricity. So.
Right. All right. Well, I want to thank Jesse, David, and Laura for their participation today, and all of you alumni and friends for coming this morning. And as always, thank you to the Federal Reserve Board Bank for your partnership. And Mike, welcome to the Chief of Staff role for Lori Logan and Daryl Pichelle. So we hope we will see you next spring here again. We will send you a recording of the event in coming weeks. Check your email and hook 'em horns.